is David Randall, Executive Director of the Civics Alliance and the American Birthright Project, also Director of Research for the National Association of Scholars. I am delighted to be able to introduce and launch American Birthright, the Civics Alliance's model K-12 social studies standards. Now, we are going to be launching with a panel of people from different points of view. Alas, State Representative Sue Peterson of South Dakota was supposed to be here, but there's been a personal emergency, so she cannot make it, alas. I am going to be speaking myself first about what precisely is the K-12, the American Birthright. Then Douglas Norlander, who is a social studies teacher, can talk about it from the point of view of a teacher. And I just want to emphasize, we want this to be useful for teachers in the classroom. It really matters. So having somebody be able to talk about that is something we want the public to know about. Then Nicole Niley, who is president of Parents Defending Education, will be talking about it from the point of view of grassroots groups, parents, what they can do to use and work with this. And then Jenna Robinson, who is president of the James Martin Center for Academic Renewal in North Carolina, is going to be talking about this from the point of view of a state policy institute. So these are going to be 4 points of view to talk about the social studies standards. Now, I'm just going to say very quickly, we all talk. There's then going to be questions and answers moderated by yours truly. We will have questions and answers from everybody. When we end, probably in the neighborhood of 3:30 or even 3:45, if there's a lot of questions, if you have leftover questions, send them to me, randall@nas.org, randall@nas.org, and I will be delighted to answer questions myself, forward them to the panelists so they can have the option to respond to you. And this will be recorded on the National Association of Scholars YouTube channel within 24 hours. And indeed, we ought to be putting a link to it on the front page of the American Birthright Social Studies Standards. When you do put in your own questions for the chat, there's a chat and a Q&A button at the bottom. Please put your questions there. Love to respond there, and either I will forward your questions, or conceivably other panelists can answer them directly. So having said all that, let me talk a bit about what is American Birthright. Chance, if you could maybe put up the image of the cover onto the screen also, that would be lovely. So American Birthright. American Birthright is a model social studies standard for the K-12 grades written to teach America's foundational history of liberty. And we want Americans to be able to use American Birthright to craft their own social studies standards, curricula, textbooks, the lesson plans we need to sustain our republic and our nation. And indeed, this, the one thing I hope people take away from this, states and school districts should create social studies standards modeled on American Birthright because it teaches American students their birthright of liberty. Now, why do state social studies standards matter? State academic content standards are the most influential documents in American education. They shape what public school districts and charter schools teach, and they influence what textbook authors write, and what knowledge assessment companies, that's fancy for the College Board and other people like them, what they teach in their advanced placement examinations. They also affect teacher training, and they provide the framework for teachers' lesson plans. Now, why do you need American Birthright? The trouble is, too many state education departments and educators have already imposed standards and are in the process of imposing even worse standards, which combine misguided pedagogical theory, low academic standards, and Sadly, anti-American animus. Our current social studies standards all too frequently, they educate young Americans who are ignorant of America's history, indifferent to liberty, and estranged from their country. So that's why we need restored social studies instruction centered on freedom, to educate a new generation of Americans to secure the blessings of liberty. So this is why we have crafted American Birthright, to inspire America's state education departments, to provide the social studies standards that will teach American students this birthright of liberty. And it also equips governors, state legislators, school boards, grassroots activists, parents, American citizens, to take back their schools by providing a model for what a proper social studies instruction should be. Americans can use American Birthright to challenge the education establishment. Why don't you choose this? Now, what is American Birthright? Something crafted for the broad majority of Americans, not narrow, not partisan, doesn't pursue consensus for its own sake, but tells America's story of liberty clearly and proudly. And throughout, American Birthright teaches students to identify the ideals, institutions, and individual examples of human liberty, individualism, Republican self-government, religious freedom, and then once identified, to assess, to the extent to which civilizations have fulfilled these ideals, and describe how the evolution of these ideals in different times and places has contributed to the formation of modern American ideals. And by the way, and that's an abstract, and let me just give an individual version of this. Every student ought to be educated to be a new Harry Truman. Harry Truman had a high school education, never finished college, loved history, loved civics. Harry Truman was prepared to be an officer in the United States Army, to be a judge, to be a senator, and finally to be president of the United States. Every American ought to be prepared for that when they graduate high school, to be another Harry Truman. That's what American Birthright is aiming for. Some nuts and bolts for that. Comprehensive content knowledge in history, geography, civics, and economics. These are the four essential disciplines. These are the strands which are carried throughout the standards for all K through 12 grades. The theme is liberty above all, but there are other themes, and 7 of them: liberty, faith in nations, science and technology, economics, state and society, and culture. And all of these working together so that students can learn to understand the exceptional but fragile achievement that's embodied in the creation and preservation of the American Republic. Strands is something which is a bit of inside baseball for pedagogy. Let's talk about it in terms of grades. American Birthright provides a basic sequence of courses from kindergarten through grade 7, introduces students to the geography, history, and government of their towns, their states, the country, and the world, and also an introduction to economics. And the sequence centers its instruction on America's symbols, geography, history, and government. Grade 8 through 12, an advanced sequence of courses. Ancient and classical Mediterranean civilizations, the development of Western civilization, world history, United States history, and sequence. And this culminates in United States history and civics, where civics is the culmination, the capstone of everything. And civics is also American government. Just want to stop a moment. We have a 2-year sequence of Western civilization that's vitally important. Virtually all the states, if not all of them, have abandoned teaching a basic Western civilization course. They now teach world history courses, which are vague, often politicized, and simply don't teach students the backgrounds of the institutions and ideals of liberty which the founding fathers knew and read about, which Americans, through Martin Luther King and onward, all knew. We need to have Western civilization restored to the basic K-12 curriculum. American Birthright makes sure that this is the basic sequence. So, the basic instruction in American liberty. And not abandoning world history, in fact, doing what we think is actually a better world history course. Our 10th grade world history is far more rigorous, fact-based, full of good content and all the advanced civilizations that have made this world of ours, everything in Africa, Latin America, India, China, Japan, the Muslim world, everything in the world, and not just some vague talk about globalism, which is, alas, what you get too much. We have the documents of liberty, extensive series of primary source documents, above all, grades 8 through 12, but we're encouraging teachers to incorporate them earlier on. And how it's done, the facts, the American Birthright's learning standards are facts to learn. We don't prescribe skills. We don't prescribe pedagogy. We don't make it so that teachers spend weeks or months on skills instruction and never get to actually teaching the content. Teachers should choose freely how students learn. What the standards need to provide is what they need to learn. And selection criterion, this is perhaps the most important thing. We're providing a whole bunch of things for, which we're proffering at, they ought to be the content standards, the facts that people should know. And we want the different states to be free and flexible. But the reason we chose what we did was to teach students the story of liberty in human history, and to describe how the ideals and institutions of liberty have created and shaped America. And then that's what we're saying for anybody. However much of American Birthright you choose, whether you use a different standard, the significance for the story of liberty is the reason you should be selecting from all the facts of history to choose individuals and events. Now, having all that, there's a bunch of things we really think American Birthright does well. And I'm getting near to my own 15-minute limit, so I got to try to make that a little bit more quick. It's flexible. We designed this so that states and school districts can alter the sequence as they see fit. We want states and school districts, to abbreviate some topics, expand others, adjust the course sequences, integrate our United States history instruction with instruction in regional history, state history, local history. We want states and school districts to adjust this to fit their own needs and their own students. And that's really important. It's teacher freedom. We're not providing a curriculum, we're providing standards. Teachers and school districts are free to teach topics as they see fit, add new topics, incorporate lesson plans, sequences, unite subjects together for thematic units. We'd love to see that happen, and we've made this so it can happen. We think this is really good American Birthright for accountability, because so many of these standards are just indecipherable. They're literally a labyrinth of cross-checked tables. You cannot understand what's being said. You can't understand what's being taught. There's no way for teachers to even understand what's being said with these standards half the time. And there's no way for parents to hold teachers accountable for how well they teach the courses. So our simple structure, a list of bullet points, for social studies disciplines only, just the facts, it makes it really easy to have that sort of clear pedagogy, clear, accountable teaching. And it's real preparation for a college and a career, because real college and career preparation means preparing people, Americans, who are competitive, ambitious, they have broad background knowledge. They can absorb and synthesize large numbers of facts. They can listen sympathetically to multiple points of view, engage in free debate, be ready to be judged for their ability to timely and competent work, and they have independence of conscience and mind. That's what we are preparing for when we say American Birthright prepares for college and career. And, oh gosh, it's useful for reliable assessment. It's really going to be really easy for the Educational Testing Service or state level testing tests to build on the standards provided by American Birthright. And this, I think, is a really important thing, equal opportunity. Unfortunately, a great many people in the education establishment seem to think that the way to have equality or equity is to just have reduced rigor in the content, because they think that the easier they make it, somehow the more equality this is. And this just contradicts all the best research, which shows that disadvantaged students benefit the most from intensive content instruction. And they benefit even more than better off students who will receive large amounts of content knowledge from their families and peers, no matter what. So content standards that focus on skills and abbreviate content, they foster an unequal society, because they especially harm the education of disadvantaged children. Now, an American Birthright's intensive content standards fulfill America's promise of equal educational opportunities for everyone. Now, there's more I can say and could say. We're out-competing critical race theory because we're providing better instruction. That's really important. We're collaborating with all sorts of good curricula. We want people to adopt good curricula from whatever sort, Hillsdale 1776 curriculum, Great Hearts Academies, basis curriculum schools, 1776 Unites, focused lesson plans in African American history, what will be coming from AAT education, all that's great. And we also want good companion legislation. Civics Alliance has a lot of model legislation, which can really help to get American Birthright standards in, or something like them. And we have a load of material on our website, the American Birthright website, which is supposed to help everybody, parents, activists, policy groups, send model letters to an editor, have a speech before a speech board, an action guide for state policymakers. We're trying to make sure that this is not just a standard that's out there. We want a movement by all Americans to work to restore excellent social studies as instruction to America. So we have all this material on our websites. We're going to be pushing for this. It's going, anything you might want to make American Birthright happen, it's on the website. So I've said all that, and I could just keep on talking about this forever, and because I'm the moderator, I'm going to give myself the hook and say, David Randall, you must stop talking now. Thank you, David Randall. Mr. Norlander, would you be so kind as to give us the teacher's perspective on American Birthright?
I will, and David, what you said was just really well spoken, and I could say amen to much of what you said there. And so thank you for that summary. That was great. So my name is Doug Norlander. I've taught US, world, and European history in high school for 34 years, mainly AP European, AP World, and AP US. I grew up in Duluth, Minnesota, which is up on Lake Superior in the northern part. Has a beautiful tropical weather. And I think Mark Twain actually spent time up there once. And I think he said that the coldest winter I ever experienced was the summer I lived in Duluth. So it tells you a little bit about the people in that part of Minnesota. I want to first make a few comments about the Minnesota Social Studies standards that just came out a couple of years ago. And then I also want to comment on why I think the American Birthright is such a wonderful curriculum or standards for social studies. So first of all, every 10 years, they update the standards for social studies in Minnesota. And I just looked at the 2000 and 2010 social standards for Minnesota, and they're fairly traditional. They have events, they have dates. It's a pretty common curriculum for social studies. The 2020 standards represented a radical departure from 2010. And the focus seemed to be on things like activism, race, anti-Western ideas, and viewing history from multiple perspectives. Now, perspectives are very important in history. I encourage that for kids to look at events from different viewpoints. But if you untether that from the real story, you just have a bunch of kids with a bunch of opinions. And that's what I try to emphasize in AP history, especially when you write an essay or when you promote a thesis, that you back it up with facts, you back it up with examples. And I think what I'm finding out, especially in the last maybe 5 years or so, a huge decline in what kids know. And this has been very alarming to me, especially in the last few years. So let me give you some examples here from the Minnesota history standards in 2020. So this first standard I'm going to read, it's on immigration. And here's what it says. Explain the difference between an immigrant and a refugee. Describe various immigrant, migrant, and refugee groups, including Hmong, Somali, and Latinos who have come to the United States. Now, one of the things that I think of when I read that standard, there's nothing about the Irish, there's nothing about the Germans, there's nothing about Europeans, and you see that throughout these Minnesota standards. Also, many of the standards are vaguely written and difficult to actually meet for students. So let me read one here. This is for 9th graders in world history in Minnesota. Historical sources and evidence. Investigate a variety of historical sources by A, analyzing primary and secondary sources, identifying perspectives and narratives that are absent from the available sources, C, interpreting the historical context, intended audience, purpose, and author's point of view of these sources. Number one, that's a bunch of claptrap that's very wordy. And I actually do that for AP kids. And if I can even get the kids by the end of the year to understand what point of view is, I feel like I've accomplished a lot. So for high school teachers to teach that standard would take weeks. It would take a lot of time. And it's really hard to meet that standard, especially for kids that are newly arrived immigrants coming into our country. In the initial 2020 standards, there was nothing mentioned on World War II or the Holocaust. This was pointed out to the committee, and they said it was an oversight, which says a lot about the committee. There was an overly large focus on Native American history. Now, that's a very important topic, especially for early American history, but 20% of the standards were on Native American history, which to me is quite too much. There's an additional focus on ethnic studies. In fact, that's one of the 5 anchor standards for Minnesota. The problem with including ethnic studies is you have to take out something else. And as I read the 2010 standards versus the 2020, there was a really decline in the focus on things like the Industrial Revolution, the New Deal, and the Cold War. And my thought on ethnic studies is that's a fine topic to study, but that should be an elective. That should never be part of the basic social studies curriculum for high school students. There's a big focus on institutional racism. And let me just read you one of the standards here in Minnesota. It says, examine the construction of racialized hierarchies based on colorism, I'm not sure what that is, and dominant European beauty standards and values. Examine the construction of hierarchies based on classism, racism, colorism, and dominant beauty standards and values. So you see this neo-Marxist idea that's promoted. The other thought I had is that's a very uncomfortable topic for teachers to teach. And I think in our current environment, I think I could see a teacher saying something and get fired for it, or get in trouble for it. Here's another standard on the Civil War, if I can find it here. Interpret multiple primary sources related to the Civil War and abolition in order to analyze how Black and white abolitionists successfully pressured the US government to end slavery. So first of all, there's nothing mentioned about the Gettysburg Address. There's nothing mentioned about Antietam, the Emancipation Proclamation. They almost discard the war, but they totally focus on someone's perspective on slavery. The other thing that I notice is that instead of saying, in order to analyze how abolitionists successfully pressured the US, there's a focus on white and Black. So you see that throughout the entire document. A lot of the newer curriculum is quite anti-Western and quite anti-American, and seems to focus on things like imperialism, war and race. And there's a lack of a positive focus on American history, things like the Marshall Plan, things about the Constitution guaranteeing rights for all Americans, or things like, you know, the US entering World War I and World War II and defeating fascism. And I always think it's important that a high school history teacher focuses on a balanced approach. And I remember I think it was about 10 years ago, right before the election, a group of kids said, "Mr. Norlander, who did you vote for in the election?" And I kind of paused a little bit and I said, "Well, who do you think I voted for?" And 70% of them were actually wrong. And I actually took that as a compliment, because I do a lot in my classes to teach a balanced approach, to not inject my own opinion, but try to tell the story and let the facts speak for themselves. And I think we're missing that perspective, I think, in the current way high school classes are taught. The final point I want to make about the Minnesota standards and about standards in general, I think there's a lack of nuance. And I always ask the question, US history compared to what? Like, what was happening in China? What was happening in the Arab world or in India? A lot of kids, when they leave high school, have a very negative view of American history. They focus on race, they focus on slavery, and inequalities. And those topics should be talked about. I talk about slavery a lot. I talk about the civil rights movement in a lot of detail. But the kids almost think, well, America was the only country that had slavery, or the only country that had segregation. And there's this lack of a global perspective, I think, that we need to bring back into the curriculum, where the kids have this nuanced and broad perspective. So let me give you a couple of reasons why I like the American Birthright so much. Number one, I love the name. I think it's very Lincoln-esque. I also like the fact that there's a focus on carrying on the events and the stories that shaped our country. We need to know where we came from and how our country was formed. And I think it was David McCullough who once said that if you inherit a masterpiece and you know nothing about the author or nothing about the piece of art, it's worthless. And so I think if you don't know our history, you don't really have a connection to our past. You don't know how important it was that people sacrificed so much to give us the country that we have. I also see that this is a way to promote national solidarity that David talked about earlier. I think by focusing on liberty and focusing on the facts of history, that it encourages a respect and a love for our country that brings our country together. And it kind of reminds me of World War II. So when I teach World War II, I try to focus on the fact that every American was involved in that event. Young people, the elderly, people of color, everybody worked together to make that happen. And I think that that should be a theme throughout our history that makes us a very special people. There's been a really marked decline in what students know about history. Let me give you two examples. So I don't teach Solomon anymore. I used to always teach that story about Solomon's wisdom taking the baby and the two mothers there that claim to be the mothers of the baby, because kids really don't have a reference to the Bible anymore. It's very sad. I've seen a really big decline in what the kids know about the Bible. The other thing is a couple months ago, I had a question about Mao. So normally I start my classes out with this day in history. I might have a quote, I might have a poem or a picture that I read to the kids or show to the kids. And so it was about Mao and it was about his birthday. And I said, this man was born on this day and whatever it was, and no one knew it in all 5 classes. I even mentioned a couple clues about the Great Leap Forward or about the Cultural Revolution. And it kind of lets me know that someone's dropping the ball on education. If the kids don't know who Mao is, that's very sad. I never get mad at the kids because they're a product of the school. They're a product of their culture or their families. The other thing that I thought about there, it always impresses me when I meet certain kids from other parts of the world. So there was a foreign exchange student that we had from France this past year. She knew more about our history than most of my students. And I asked her a little bit about that. And she said, in France, we don't play games. We don't have projects. We do a lot of, studying the history and knowing the facts. And she was very confident and very well versed in what she could talk about. So there again, I go to this idea that, it's great to have conversations. It's great to have critical thinking skills. But if you don't know the facts, it's very shallow. And so sadly, a lot of our kids today lack that knowledge. The other thing that I like about the American Birthright is that it repositions the importance of knowledge over political correctness. It's very thorough, it's very balanced, and I also think it reassures teachers what is to be taught, because a lot of the standards are worded in ways that are very vague, and sometimes teachers don't know what to teach. And so sometimes you might get a school where one teacher spends 2 weeks on the Civil War, where another teacher spends a day on it. So you get a lot of inequalities in what kids are exposed to. And I think if schools, if districts, if states embrace the American Birthright, there's going to be a total understanding of what it is that's going to be taught. And I think I like the idea of what David said about accountability and testing. Kids exactly know these are the topics that we're going to teach. And this is what teachers are expected to teach throughout the year. Because in the current situation, there's a lot of inequality of what is focused on. I don't think there's a lot of focus on the facts. I think sometimes teachers tend to promote their own agenda. A lot of that gets political. And I've heard many examples of that. So I like the fact that this curriculum could bring us together, share our common heritage, share our stories. And I can see it being a really great piece for bringing our country together. So I have a few other thoughts that I think I'll wait for the Q&A.
Thank you so much. That's wonderful. I must say, it's really wonderful to hear this from the point of view of a teacher. And indeed, and what you're saying about that it will help the teachers. That's just wonderful to hear. Next, may I please ask Nicole Niley, President of Parents Defending Education.
Hi, thank you so much for having me on. It's such a deep honor to be involved in this important project. I run a group called Parents Defending Education, which is pretty new compared to NAS and some of our other friends on the call. We launched just last year to help parents of students in the K-12 system figure out what the heck was going on. I think as many people saw during lockdown what their children were or were not learning during Zoom school, families were horrified because school today obviously is far different than it was when many of us grew up. And I think obviously in the wake of George Floyd's murder, a lot of schools' activism really kicked into overdrive. We saw districts across the country sending out all district emails saying that they were systemically racist. I think a lot of parents thought, well, what is this? Did you just call me names? And again, curriculum took a big turn. And so when parents had this window into their children's classroom, they were discouraged. And because it was, things have fallen off significantly from what I think many of us recall learning at when we were all in school. And so, we have seen over the past year, 2 years, parents rising up, parents becoming deeply, deeply unhappy about what has been taking place in American schools. People are mad about the race and gender theory lessons that are being taught in school that teach children to view each other through the lens of identity politics and pitting each other against their peers. They're mad about the elimination of gifted and talented programs because which are done obviously in the name of equity. So let's bring high achieving students down to a lower level. They're mad that districts are spending finite budget dollars to bring in equity consultants and diversity consultants, making huge amounts of money while our districts plead pauper and go and say that they need to pass new bond initiatives because they don't have enough money for essential things like books or buildings. They're mad that children are having their gender transitioned behind their backs without anybody knowing what's going on. Districts saying parents don't have a right to that information. And they're mad that when they raise these issues to their school board, to their state boards of education, they're mocked by their elected officials and as well as by members of the media. So one thing in getting parents defending education off the ground, in speaking to thousands of parents from across the country over the past 18 months, we have a tip line. People send us things on a daily basis. I mean, since our launch last March, we actually have been receiving between 50 to 200 tips a week from across the country, which is absolutely astonishing. We ask people to send us things, back up. We ask them, send a screenshot, send a PDF, send us hyperlink so that we can prove this and then we can send it out. Bob in Omaha might not know how to get something that's going on in his district to Tucker Carlson, but we can help with that. We have noticed that, as people have gotten smart over the past year, as the scales have fallen from their eyes about what their children are learning or not learning, people last year, when they got smart, this year is the year they wanted to do something about it. And we wanted to give people both the knowledge about what their rights are, as well as, the pieces that they need to go out and be better and more articulate advocates for their children. One of those things that they need is they need alternative curriculum to propose when they see what's going on. Last year, I'm so grateful for everything the National Association of Scholars did in regards to the 1619 project. That was something that was sweeping the country. Last year, we saw even the Department of Education tried to hijack a civics grant program to encourage districts to adopt the 1619 project, to adopt E. Brown Kennedy's work. We helped over 12,000 people submit comments to the Federal Register saying, please don't do this. Please use the civics grant program actually for civics. And the Department of Education actually backed off of that. But in that process, we learned in talking to parents that you can't just walk in and say, hey, don't teach this thing. What actually helps is that when you walk in and say, don't teach this thing because of here's how factually inaccurate it is. Thank you again, and National Association of Scholars. But then to go in and say, you know what, would you consider this other curriculum that is more comprehensive, that has more detail, that is, provides a better and more comprehensive look at American history. And so that is, I think, this amazing tool, and why I'm so grateful for the launch of the American Birthright Project, because it is a concrete and positive thing that parents can bring to the table. We have noticed recently, the state of Virginia recently put out a study where they asked parents and then they compared what how people thought that their children were doing. I think for 8th grade proficiency levels, about 90% of parents assumed that their children were performing at grade level for reading, writing, mathematics. Unfortunately, what the numbers bore out was that actually only about 36% of students in 8th grade in Virginia are reading, writing, or performing math at grade level. And so there's this tremendous gap in between what people expect their children are learning versus what children are actually learning. And I'm so grateful for Douglas's comments before, because I think there is, schools and states have this huge amount of discretion. One thing that has come on our radar, just as Douglas mentioned, is the ethnic studies debacle that has been sweeping the country. That was very instructive, I think, for many of us who are frankly very new to education reform. I consider myself kind of an accidental activist on this K-12 education front. I didn't know how curriculums were adopted or what the schedule was for any of these things. And when we saw what happened in California last year with the kind of extremely crazy and bombastic first version of the ethnic studies curriculum, when that was first rolled out, it was deeply anti-Semitic. There were a lot of extremely objectionable parts to it, but we saw the citizens of California weigh in through the various iterations of the curriculum's consideration. We were able to dial it back, or parents were able, and community members were able to dial it back to a place where it was not as crazy and hateful as the first version was. But even where they ended up is still, I think, above and beyond where most people are comfortable with. And again, many of us have been gaslit. We've been, accused of wanting to not teach history, to whitewash history. That's not what's taking place whatsoever. But people do have an objection to the kinds of things that are being inserted and the kinds of narratives that have been inserted into social studies curriculum. And then even after, what ended up being a fairly watered down version of the ethics studies bill was passed, we're now seeing local districts take and adopt the original crazy versions, and that did have extremely anti-Semitic components to it. There was recently a lawsuit that was successful, brought by our friends at the California Foundation for Equal Rights, challenging the inclusion of an Aztec prayer in it, where we oppose compelled religion in schools, yet this is something that the California Ethnic Studies curriculum was trying to force through. And so there is power in people weighing in and parents weighing in, but there is, at the end of the day, tremendous power in parents being able to go in and say, this is what I like. And I think not until now has there been one really detailed and extremely comprehensive curriculum for parents to advocate for. There are 5 states right now this year that have social studies curriculum up for review by their state agencies. Colorado, Washington, D.C., Louisiana, Minnesota, and New Mexico all have their social studies curriculums under consideration. As Douglas alluded to, the first version that Minnesota was looking at didn't include the Holocaust in the World War II curriculum. I'm actually not sure how you can talk about World War II without having the Holocaust included, but that's something that Minnesota actually tried to slide in, but thanks to the vigilance of a bunch of education scholars in Minnesota, they're able to call that out. And so, parents are obviously on much stronger footing when they come to the table with concrete solutions, with positive alternatives. And that's why we're so grateful again to the National Association of Scholars and the Civics Alliance for developing this, because it will be a powerful and compelling tool for people to speak to their local school boards, to speak to their state agencies and say, this is what I want, and here is what I wanted. It is clear, it is concise, it is comprehensive, and we're very grateful for all your efforts. So thank you.
Oh, thank you so much. And wonderful to hear that again from your point of view. And I should say, what you were saying about having the 5 states coming up, one of the things we're working on is to get a schedule listed every state in the nation. We want everybody to know what is the schedule in each state, plus the District of Columbia, so that every parent will know what's up. Because just having the basic information, my state is having its social studies standards up for revision, that really matters. So thank you so much for highlighting that in particular. I am now going to go to Jenna Robinson, president of the James Martin Center for Academic Renewal in North Carolina. And I must say, a really great national resource on education, higher education. It's just wonderful to read the work. Oh, you're still muted.
There. Thank you, David. And thank you to NAS for having me on the panel today. I'm excited to be here in such an august group. As David said, I'm with the James G. Martin Center for Academic Renewal in Raleigh, North Carolina. We're a public policy organization that promotes excellence in higher education. We advocate for responsible governance, viewpoint diversity, academic quality, cost-effective education solutions, and innovative market-based reform. And I will get to the higher education angle on this after I make some other remarks about the standards. So with that said, I want to commend NAS and David for such excellent work. The standards are such a welcome addition to our toolkit for education reform, everyone's toolkit. David just shared NAS's lofty goal for history education to help schools create high school graduates like President Harry Truman. And I think that's a wonderful goal we're pursuing. And it's not an exaggeration that if we have good standards, something like that can be done. And these model standards really are that good. I'll tell you what I told David after I first read the standards, and that is if I had to take a test on these materials right now, I would fail. That's a testament, of course, to the rigor and quality of these model standards. Nothing is left out. But it's also a condemnation of my own disjointed and inadequate history instruction in American public schools. I wish I could go back and learn history and civics to this high of a standard. We'll still need well-prepared teachers and motivated students for the standards to do their work, but I think this is an excellent and necessary starting place. So David, congratulations. What David asked me to do is to explain how state policy organizations can benefit from the new standards and can use them. And I think I'll echo what Nicole said. It's wonderful to have, in my hand, a concrete alternative model to promote. Right now in education reform, it feels like playing whack-a-mole with the left. They come up with a questionable educational practice like whole language instruction, and we keep finding instances of it to defeat or eradicate in our schools. And you have to keep doing the same thing over and over and over. It seems like the instances of the problems keep multiplying. And the very existence of the term social studies is a testament to the fact that so far we have lost the battle for history and civics instruction. Since its beginning, social studies has been kind of a grab bag for leftist experiments. And so these model standards with their focus on content and facts are a much needed antidote to that. Prior to social studies, high schools offered more of a history-centered program that usually included formal studies in ancient, medieval, modern, and American history. And the courses were deliberately created as a gateway to effective citizenship. And I see that these model standards kind of go back to that tradition. As we all know, the current standards are failing to create effective citizens. And right now we are fighting against various bowdlerized versions of history, civics, and geography in our schools. We fight a particular textbook or a worksheet or a lesson plan. Whereas what we need to do is replace the whole rubric of social studies with something that is better. And so I think that's what these model standards give us, an opportunity to focus on a positive change instead of doing the same thing over and over again. So having that something better available to promote will be extremely helpful for state think tanks. One thing it'll give them, and I think Nicole really made this clear too, is that it's a chance to say yes to something. State think tanks spend a lot of time saying no. And we get a bad rap for not wanting to do anything productive. And we all know that most Americans have this bias towards doing something, even if it's not the right thing. We all know that reputation is undeserved. Conservatives have been in the business of building things, building civilization. Since the beginning, we're part of a great tradition of creating an ordered liberty. But we get the reputation of always saying no. There's a great Edmund Burke quote: "Rage and frenzy will pull down more in half an hour than prudence, deliberation, and foresight can build up in 100 years. And today's social studies curriculum is a great example of pulling something down. But by being for a good set of standards, instead of pretty much everything that modern schools are doing, we can get back to the business of building things up. And so I think that will be great for state think tanks. We can also stop playing whack-a-mole. We can focus attention on a comprehensive reform that addresses a lot of the problems kind of all in one fell swoop, instead of continuing to pick things off piecemeal. If teachers are responsible for promoting or for teaching particular facts, we will be able to hold them to that standard rather than having to keep an eagle eye out for problems that may be happening in the classroom. We also, with this new standard, thank you NAS, don't have to create reform ideas from scratch. David, thank you again, has done the work for us. The model standards as they are written are already set up to include state history in the 3rd grade. And as David said, they're flexible enough to fit different curricula, to fit what different states are doing. It's simply a standards framework rather than prescribed books, prescribed curriculum. And so state think tanks can take it, use it as a model, and move on from there to promote what fits regionally or in that state context. So I highly recommend that state think tanks incorporate these model standards into their recommendations for K-12 education policy reforms, things that they're recommending to states, to school districts, for testing, and for history education licensure. But now I want to pivot and talk about why this is relevant for higher education, which is my own field. And the reason is that higher education has utterly dropped the ball on civics and history. And that's part of a larger problem, which is that general education curriculum has been gutted at most universities. There are a few who still do a great job, and those aren't the ones I'm talking about. I'm talking about the vast majority of our both public and private institutions that have turned our general education curriculum into a smorgasbord instead of a prescription for creating thriving citizens. And I'll use UNC Chapel Hill, which is one of my own alma maters, as the example. So at UNC, history is now called engagement with the human past. And you can take a broad survey of courses to fulfill the engagement with the human past category, but you can also take something much more narrow. For example, you could take radical communities in 20th century American religious history to fulfill that history requirement, or anthropological perspectives on food and culture. And obviously those courses where they might be very interesting, they are not giving students what they need in terms of learning about the history of our world, the history of our culture and country. And one of the reasons that we see this smorgasbord of choices is that universities are focused now more on skills than on knowledge. Here's a quote from UNC. "Learning about the human past is about more than reading the history. It is about discovering primary evidence and sources and applying the knowledge you've gained to modern problems. Learn and evaluate how the events shaping the world today have been shaped by the events of the past and how to identify the patterns of human history that shape our lives." There is no focus on any particular body of knowledge. They're more concerned that students have encountered a primary source than which document it is. They are completely agnostic as to whether students have read the Constitution or someone's letters, from the past, regardless of who that person is. And one of the reasons they do this, I think it's partially an excuse, but one of the reasons they state is that they assume totally erroneously that students are getting the basics in K-12 and are ready to jump in at the next level. Other speakers have mentioned that the knowledge that students actually have is woefully lacking. And so universities are incorrect in making this assumption that students are ready to jump in at the next level of history learning. They really do need to get back to the basics. Frankly, it should be the case that when students get to a university, they can go deeper into the material because they have gotten a sound basic education. I would like it to be that way. I think that these model standards, if implemented, could absolutely get us to that place. And I think that it is ideal that high school is the place, or K-12 in general is the place where students learn this information, because it's important for all students to get a sound footing in history and civics, regardless of whether they go to college. This is our American heritage. It's all of our birthright, not just students who go on to post-secondary education, and it should be taught to everyone. So thank you to the NAS. Thank you, David.
Well, thank you so much. So look, it's been wonderful hearing from all of you. And now we get to the point where I encourage questions from the audience, which, the first one coming from Becky Garrettson in Alabama, which I will say, thank you. Are there suggested curricula that go along with the standards? Okay, and I'm going to speak to this one because so we've recommended a number of people who we think are good one way or another. Hillsdale has its 1776 curriculum. The Great Hearts Academy has a wonderful approach. Basis Schools is really good intensive education. AAT is going to be coming out with American history for built around Wilfred McClay's wonderful textbook, Land of Hope. And if you want stuff like thematic lesson plans, 1776 Unites. If you look in the chat, our technical guru, Chance Layton, has just put in our recommended curricula. Now, when I say recommended, I want to be careful. We don't want to favor any particular curriculum. We're trying officially to stay neutral, partly because we want to encourage as many people as possible to do good stuff. We want, if you can send in something you think is good, which we can mention, go for it, please. We'd love to add more. But that's partly because we want to stay neutral among all the different possibilities. We're trying not to be forcing everybody into one thing. And then I want to build onto that. We don't want to do a national curriculum. We don't want to be the back door to force something on all 50 states. We want there to be variations. We love it. We love American Birthright. We think it's good. We want people to use it. But even if you were to use it, we want it to be different in the different states and the different school districts. You should be able to get to college and have a good conversation with somebody from across the country where you've got some stuff in common, but some stuff it's going to be, hey, I didn't read that. That's great. That's something I can learn about too. And we will have true pluralism of thought if we continue to have variation in our curriculum. So anyway, that's something which we really care about. If anybody else wants to speak to that, sorry, that's my own rant. Going once. All right, are there other questions coming in from the audience? I will, if forced to, actually say things about the details of American Birthright for people, if people don't have questions. And indeed, actually, I have details about the curriculum, but I guess I'd actually like to also talk a bit about all the stuff that's been on the website for what we want to do. And I guess let me just start for people just to talk a little bit about the action suggestions for state policymakers. I'm going to say, by the way, we have a lot of state policymakers who have endorsed this. We're members of the coalition. Lieutenant Governor Mark Robinson in North Carolina, Assistant Minority Leader Rob Sampson in Connecticut, in Ohio, Don Jones, who is the minority whip. So, in Louisiana, a whole bunch of state legislators, including Chuck Owens. We're deeply grateful for all of them. And I say those names not to be invidious about anybody I haven't mentioned, but because I want hundreds more to join in. This gets us back to action suggestions for state policymakers. Some of what we do is to encourage state policymakers to get a handle on everything their education departments are doing. So we have suggestions which include, finding out, what exactly is happening, the schedule, getting, in contact with grassroots groups so they can do testimonies, in legislative testimony, making sure that the committees which are done to prepare a new standard, that everybody who, it's not just members of a radical elite who are appointed to the committee, everybody needs to be aware now is the time to apply to get onto the committee so they can have a job in creating it. There's more, but I actually have a question now. But I wanted to emphasize we have that in addition to grassroots activists. A question from Robert Osborne. To what degree does the left-wing or perhaps neo-Marxist bias in our universities undermine or challenge our efforts to introduce these American Birthright standards at the level of state policymaking? Jenna.
I think that's a really good question. And I think that we start with the standards, but it's really important to align other pieces of education. You mentioned testing, David, and I think that if we align the testing with the standards, so then we can evaluate teachers based on what their students are learning. That's a very important way to enforce what's going with the standards say you ought to be doing that you're actually doing it. I think we should also try to align teacher licensure with the standards so that teachers who are going to teach history are tested in the exact same facts to make sure that they're prepared to teach to the standards. And so I think we need alignment between all of these things so that universities have really strong incentives to make sure that their history teachers are learning the state standards instead of learning, neo-Marxist history or really just esoteric history or niche history that is not useful for most K-12 students.
I think that's a great point, Jenna. I mean, we hear all the time from people who are so frustrated about, I mean, we have a lot of tips that come in through our tip line that come from teachers. And there does, I think in some respects, seem to be almost a generational switch between older teachers that have been in the profession for a long time and younger teachers that have come from teaching schools where they are marinated in all of this stuff. And then when those teachers then are in the classroom, then they have to spend a full day doing a professional development session on all of this stuff too. And I feel like I'm like actually speaking about something that Douglas should be speaking about.
No, that was well said. And I really like the idea of using this to update your certification in teaching, because a lot of the workshops that are offered to, update your license are based on politically correct topics that have nothing to do with what you're teaching. So I would like it, David, if you could kind of work out with state legislatures, if there's a way to use this curriculum as a way to update, licenses. And the other thought I had on this topic is that a lot of the high school history teachers that are teaching right now don't have a history degree. They have an education degree. So many of them are ill-versed in a lot of these topics that we're talking about. And I would advocate that everyone that teaches American history or world history actually has a degree in the topic. And I think David McCullough once said that attitude is caught, not taught. And a lot of teachers are real hesitant about what they know. So I think they always revert back or default back to, teaching globalism or teaching these vague ideas. And a lot of them don't have a real deep passion for loving history. And I think that having the American Birthright to help, recertify them would be a great way to bring back content for high school history teachers.
I will say, so the Civics Alliance has a whole bunch of model legislation, and indeed we want to reshape teacher licensure as well. I'm only going to say that we know that's extremely complicated legislation in each state, and therefore we're not just diving in head forward with like, you should do this everywhere, because we know that in each state you need to think it through. So deeply in favor of this, maybe working out detailed legislation as it goes forward, but we know it's so complicated that we don't want to do this wrong. We want to do this right. So we're, we absolutely in favor of reform teacher licensure, make it so that you have to have a history major to teach social studies and good history courses, have these questions in the licensure, but what precisely you want to recommend to state legislators want to have everything done right for the details, because that really matters. There was a question from Matthew Vadam, again, about what standards are. And and we said this in the beginning, it's worth repeating because it is a little complicated. They're not the curricula in each school district. They're not the curricula in the classroom. The standards guide the school districts. The standards guide the teachers. They say, however you get there, this is what you've got to get to. And since they're guiding, among other things, state tests, if you want to teach your kids to do well in a state test, you got to pay attention to the standards. So it's looser than a curriculum, but when it's in place, there's a limit to how far any curriculum can depart from there, even in the states which have a great deal of local autonomy. So it's not everything in a state, but it's the single most important document produced in each state for its education. And that's why it matters. And that's, we live in a world which is full of bureaucratic documents, especially at the government level. And this is the one which really matters. That's why we're focusing on this one. And unfortunately, in every part of American life, you got to pay attention to the bureaucratic documents nowadays. So that's the answer to that. Sorry, let me just see. There were other questions I wanted to answer, but that's worth saying again, because it can be inside baseball, but it shouldn't be. Everybody needs to know what these standards are and why they matter. There is a question from, have any of you, White Martindale, have any of you considered Paul Johnson's History of the American People? let me just give you this, the Civics Alliance Executive Director's thought. We'd be we're delighted with whatever people choose as their textbooks and so on. I've read the history of the American people. I think it's a great history. My memory is, I'm not sure it's perfectly suited to be a textbook. And I might have to defer to Mr. Norlander there. But in effect, I'm not sure I think it's perfectly suited to be a textbook, but a really good textbook, like plug, Wilfred McClay, Land of Hope, should prepare somebody to be able to read history of the American people, which I just want to say, it's a delight. It's just a joy. And I must say, by the way, if you're going beyond it, he has a book called The Birth of the Modern about early 19th century Europe, which is an even further, for those of us who are Europeanists. Mr. Norlander, may I go to you, what you think of Paul Johnson's History of the American People and its suitability?
Yeah, I would agree with everything you said. I think it's a great read. I think it's very well written, and he's one of my favorite historians, but I don't think it's really set up for a curriculum. I think it would be good background reading for a teacher, but not for curriculum.
And unless anybody else want to jump in on Mr. Johnson? Great writer. Question from Will Johnson. Who at the state level makes the decisions about the social studies standards? Are there opportunities to influence our state standards before they come up for formal review? And it's amazing how I have planned by the end of the summer, and ideally even sooner, we want an information packet for all 50 states, because that's an absolutely crucial question. Who makes the decisions bureaucratically at each level? But I want to add to that, in some sense, it doesn't matter. The state legislature can still intervene no matter what. They can make a new law. So you need to know who is making the decisions, and usually it's going to be buried somewhere in your state education department's website. And I must say, you have no idea the blood, sweat, and tears that are going into preparing these information packets for you. But, you know, so it's being made, it will be available soon, but don't get caught up too much, because in a pinch, go to your state legislators, agitate, make a direct intervention. That's always going to be possible. So that's what I'm going to say immediately. Does anybody else want to talk about that?
I'll say very briefly that some of the things we've advocated for, like free speech on college campuses, it took 10 years. So you can never start too soon, and you can never say it too often.
Yeah. Yeah. Let me actually just, we have like, all right, here's our official goal. We would love by the year 2026 if half of the states had incorporated material from American Birthright. That's the goal. Everybody go out there and do that. Having said that, we know this is an optimistic goal. We want you to have that in your mind. Wouldn't it be great by the, you know, the 250th anniversary of America that we had started really to reclaim the social studies curriculum? But it's going to be a 10-year process. It's going to be a 20-year process. Some states will be easier, some states will be harder. It's never too soon to start, as you say, and it will be, you know, the 10-year, the 20 years of effort. It can work. Let me just interrupt one more to say how you know it can work. This really matters. Louisiana. Just this last fall, Louisiana was coming down with some really terrible draft social studies standards. There was a huge grassroots rebellion. There was grassroots activists worked, state legislators worked. They managed to head it off at the pass. Dr. Cade Brumley, the state superintendent of education in Louisiana, came back with some really good standards instead. I mean, clearly he should have chosen American Birthright, but it wasn't published yet. So he did really good with what he had. But the point is, in Louisiana, it worked. We know it can work. People can get activated for good social studies standards. You can make it happen. Louisiana is just the first place. It can happen in every state in the union. We know it can happen, and it will happen. Other people want to speak on that subject? Okay. I have a question from Don Headley. how can we unite to emphasize teachers who gain their degrees in solid content-oriented disciplines as opposed to an education degree akin to underwater basket weaving? We've had, I think, some answers related to this, but I guess what are the tactics people would emphasize for you to push for? Again, I have answers too, but I'd love to hear other people first.
Yeah, I don't know what
Go
the
ahead.
answer is to this, but I've just come across a lot of teachers. They're well-intended, they're good people, they're good teachers, but they just don't have a real nuanced or in-depth understanding of history. And maybe we need to talk to legislatures about this and say, hey, you know, if you get a degree in history, maybe there's an incentive, a financial incentive. I don't know what it is, but we definitely have to get people that are passionate about their subject and are better versed in their subject, because there's a lot of people that teach economics that have hardly ever taken an economics course. And there's a lot of examples of this. And so I like the idea of being flexible on this and even re-looking at how we offer a license to a teacher. There's a lot of people that are former military people that would be wonderful teachers. And so I like the idea of opening things up a little bit and looking at how we license teachers, because again, I just can't believe that there's a lot of teachers that hardly have any coursework in American history that are teaching it. So I don't know what the answer is, but I like the idea of maybe talking to state legislatures and maybe doing something within a state.
Yeah, I'll add that, yes, we absolutely need to make it easier for people with degrees in content areas to do an add-on teacher licensure portion for their education. It needs to be seamless. It needs to be simple. It needs to be fast and cheap. I also will add that if there is research on whether it makes a difference in student outcomes on history, someone with a history degree versus someone with an education degree, we need to find that research and share it with our legislators. I know that the research exists that having a master's in education doesn't add anything to student learning. I don't know what the answer is about undergraduate degrees, although I suspect I know the answer, but I have not looked into the academic literature. But if it's there, we need to promote it. If it's not there, we need to make sure that that research gets done so that we have a solid reason to say teachers of history need history degrees. And that's, I think, where our state think tanks can come alongside this work that NAS has done and, you know, promote the research that's out there and make sure that the research gets done if it doesn't exist.
One thing we have tried to work with our families on is to remind them that teachers are not the bad guys always. And I think there is always kind of a default setting, but I think teachers end up kind of implementing what they are told by their principals, by their superintendents, et cetera. And also, I mean, you know, I have a child who just finished first grade and one just finished second grade. The class sizes were monstrous. There were kids that were basically feral because they've been home for 2 years. And so trying to kind of maintain control, I think there is a lot of people that are, you know, what is the easiest thing for a teacher to do? Let's look at how Turnkey, the Southern Poverty Law Center, has made their resources. There are handouts, there are teaching guides. I mean, it's easy for somebody who is stretched really thin, is stressed out a lot. And so I think the more that our friends on this call, you know, other allies in the education space can make things easy for teachers, the better we will all be, you know, the more options that are out there. And so I know it is, for many of the people we talk to, their default setting is my teacher is the bad guy. And certainly there are, and Libs of TikTok has shown there are a lot of really bad teachers out there, but I think that's not the default setting. And so I think, you know, we try and encourage people, you know, start small, you know, if you're unhappy with what's going on, the first step is not federal lawsuit. It's let's talk to the teacher and figure out what's going on and figure out maybe how we can get other options and information in front of you.
Yeah, that's a really good point, Nicole, about not making the teacher the bad guy here. I have brought in a guy that knows a lot about history. He was the general manager of a local Barnes and Noble, and he's almost read every book. And every time he comes into my classroom as a guest speaker, the kids are just amazed. And I think part of it is he's able to tell stories and get into the nuance and the details of history that kids remember for a long time. Like, I think one of the critiques that I have with the current way history is taught is it's kind of boring. It's kind of like, oh, this vague idea. And he has a really nuanced perspective. He can share a lot of stories about the Civil War, and he gets into the lives of the people and their backgrounds and their families. And kids latch onto that. Kids love that. And we need to bring more of those people into the classroom and find ways to do that.
I'm going to switch to a question which I think is really important from Julianne H. Assuming the birthright standards are intended for public schools, at some point, the other side perspectives will need to be consulted and included for decision-making and approval to implement, or they will protest and obstruct. How do you anticipate bringing all sides to the table, having productive discussions, and preventing the watering down or compromising of these standards, i.e. any plan Bs for ensuring the success and acceptance of these by the public? And this is obviously a $64,000 question. Let me just say a little bit about where we started from, which had some of these questions in mind. First off, we built on originally the 2003 Massachusetts standards, done on Dr. Sandra Stopsky, an enormously learned individual, working under Governor Mitt Romney in Massachusetts. And the point was, these were standards which were relatively conservative for Massachusetts, but which got through the approval procedures in Massachusetts in 2003. It survived the process of buy-in consultation of the teachers, the permanent education department bureaucracy. Now, sadly, it was still sandbagged afterwards and never went into effect, which is a different story. Nevertheless, we started with this framework precisely with the idea it's already pre-built so that it should have some buy-in even from people who are initially suspicious. Look, and it's not identical by a long shot. We have made changes, and we like the changes we made, but the basic framework had that in mind. So we're starting off with something which isn't meant to appeal to 2% of the population. It's meant to appeal in its very basic structure to a majority of the population. So that's where we're starting with. Now, how do you do this? It needs political willpower and a willingness to make compromise which does not hollow out. And the best thing I can say is we also stole from, we're inspired by incorporated work from Florida, because Florida now has civics standards. There was a state law, the Florida Education Department went through this under Governor DeSantis, his chancellor, people like Kevin Hoft, extremely good man for doing education policy. And the point is, it went through precisely this sort of consultation with the permanent education departments, the teachers, and it still at the end of the day was produced really good, strong standards. So I'm not going to be able to tell you exactly how this should be done. What I can say is, well, get in touch with Florida's Department of Education. But the point is, you need strong political leadership, and ideally from the governor caring about it, and the governor making, appointing a chancellor, a superintendent of education cares about it, who then has people down through the ranks who are pushing for this, but who are pushing for this while they're willing to listen to the teachers, take on board, yes, make compromises, which hopefully don't water it away to nothing. It can be done. It's been done by Governor DeSantis and its administration. What you see in Florida and its civic standards went through precisely this process of consultation. So that's, I think, what needs to be done. And I guess I just add one more thing. We keep on saying we want things to be adjusted. Another way of putting that is we don't want the perfect to be the enemy of the good. We're going to keep on pushing for strong stuff, but if there's a compromise, if it only gets somewhat better and there's still unfortunate stuff, we'll still push for the better, but we're not going to say, don't take the improvement. Always take the improvement, keep on pushing.
Well, let's also remember that, I mean,
Yeah.
this is not a one size fits all situation, right? I mean, something that will pass in Oklahoma is way different than something that is going to pass in California. And that's okay, right? And we are seeing people start to make decisions about where they want to send their child accordingly based on what, what kinds of education options exist in different places of the country. I think COVID opened a lot of people's minds to the fact that, oh, I'm not locked in here. And the fact that more people are now mobile means that, if you can telework, then yeah, I might end up in a state where I like what their standards are. I mean, I think I grew up in Chicago. We always had Casimir Pulaski Day off, which is like an obscure holiday because based on like a Polish general that helped fight in the Revolutionary War. Nobody else in the country ever had something like that. My husband is from Texas. They always had Juneteenth off, which is something I never heard of. And so I think we need to respect the fact that there are different states that will be more dialed in or more dialed back on some of the stuff, and that's okay. So.
Anybody else on that? Nope. All right. I have a question from Will Johnson. If a teacher is not teaching to the standards, how do we as parents help correct that? I think I'd ask Nicole first if you would have a thought on that.
I think the first part is, like I use this line from the old G.I. Joe cartoons, like knowing is half the battle. First is knowing what your state's standards are. And so, if and when, they're deviating from that. So that's, I think, probably the baseline. And so I think that's kind of a charge that many of us on this call, and definitely us at Parents Defending Education, need to work on, is letting people know, what your child should be learning. So you can then go to the school and say, hey, they're not. We always advise people start small, talk to the teacher. Hey, did you know that this is what the standard is? Because sometimes, unfortunately, I think teachers are bombarded with so much information, so much, so many mandates. It's, I think, kind of hard to separate the wheat from the chaff sometimes. And I think most teachers, again, I don't think are bad people. And I think a lot of them would be horrified. I didn't realize that I was like not doing what I was supposed to. If you don't get the right answer, or if, they kind of blow you off, because definitely many of us over the past 2 years have gotten blown off by our teachers and our schools, start to elevate. If you don't get the answer you want from your teacher, go to the principal, go to the superintendent, go to the board, to the school board. But again, don't start with the lawsuit. Let's try and, persuade people and really try and bring them along. There is a reason for this. I realize that many states have been issuing all these testing waivers because we don't actually want to be, hold anybody accountable. But at some point, children will have to take tests again. And if you're not teaching, what the standards are, then you're not going to be teaching what the test is. And so I think, that ends up looking bad on the teacher. And so really kind of, starting small, having a conversation, trying to, not be accusatory, but just like, hey, did you know? And kind of going from there. For those odd teachers that are, hostile, like I'm going to teach you whatever I want, those people who we see on Libs at TikTok, I have your kids 8 hours a day, you don't know what's going on behind closed doors. Yeah, those are extraordinary circumstances. And certainly there are other tactics to go after that. But, I would say maybe just start with a presumption of goodwill and operate from there.
And maybe Douglas, do you have anything to add to that, or?
Yeah, I really like the American Birthright because it definitely lays out, the curriculum in a very open way. And I think that a lot of the current curriculums are very open-ended and vague. And like I said before, one teacher teaches one thing, another teaches another. Let me add something, though, that I think is important about this conversation. Standards are great, but I think another part of teaching history is developing curiosity and an interest in the topic. So I always think I have kids that might not ever take another history class. And when they leave my classroom, I want them to have a love of history, to be interested in asking more questions. And so sometimes I play music from the era. I read a poem, or I, have a debate on something. And yes, the information is important, but I think the attitude is also important, that they like history and want to learn more about it. And so that's why I come back to that idea of stories and not just regurgitating facts, but having attitudes where the kids want to learn more. So I think that's part of it too, is developing a love of history and a love of learning that I think so many teachers don't lack, because I think the current woke-ish standards are just kind of boring, and they're just kind of clunky, and they're not based on humans. They're not based on stories. They're based on ideas and vague concepts like globalism. And kids really love learning about people. So that's a comment I would make.
before I may want to also ask Jen if she wants to contribute to this, but I just want to say I've kept on praising Land of Hope by Bill McClay. One of the reasons is it does this story so well. Every chapter, he just sort of stops. There's a paragraph, which is a story about an individual.
Yes.
He just goes from there and builds back out to the narrative. And it's just brilliantly done to excite that love and curiosity, precisely because it goes from the textbook abstraction down to the individual level and back again, and so smoothly and hundreds of times. I just wanted to say that. Jenna, did you want to add anything to this, or?
I will concur on Land of Hope that it's an excellent textbook, and it does a really good job of doing exactly what you said, talking about stories. Also, I'll go back to the standards. I think that it's the first grade standards that you've incorporated the idea of stories, of narrative, of learning about people, so that students get that feel and that love for history. And I think that especially in those early grades, these standards are really good at creating that love of history that then can build where students can get more of the facts and ideas in later grades.
Yeah. And gosh, I mean, it's a little, I wish I could have someone put it in a biography, standards thread. I mean, but it would just be wonderful to have biography be done, somehow in every single grade, so that people always know, yeah, here are the individual stories. I have a question, which I actually don't have a perfect answer for, but I think it's actually worth trying to answer it, from Warren Boulette. Either way, and I apologize whichever one of those was wrong. What organization is going to publish the consensus founding principles that every K-12 and higher ed student should be taught? And I'm going to give an answer which is partly a whiff, but it's deliberate. We tried not to have founding principles in our standards. We had founding documents. And that's, I think, very important, that you ought to know, the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, the Northwest Ordinance, the Articles of Confederation, the Bill of Rights, the Emancipation Proclamation, the Reconstruction Amendments, and then the debates, and this is crucial, the Federalist, the Anti-Federalist Papers. How shall I put this? On the one hand, I want all students to have this sort of basic love of America, and they ought to know we have these principles of liberty and equality, but at the end of the day, it is going to be a debate. And we don't want a false consensus too early. If you're going to get to the consensus, it's going to be by having this basic teaching of how Americans have debated our principles, from the very beginning. And if it is a consensus, we got to it through argument, intelligent argument, and ultimately affectionate argument. We'll put aside the Civil War as perhaps a less affectionate moment there. But the point being, you do have, this can be misdone, abused. You can get away from the sense that there's anything that people had in common. But I do think it's very important to focus on founding documents rather than founding principles. And again, I apologize if this seems a whiff, but I guess that was how we were thinking, and I do think it's important to emphasize. The three of you want, I mean, how should I've said that, but there might be people who disagree with me on this. Anybody have an alternate take on this?
Well, I know when I teach like the Gettysburg Address, I think it's so important that the kids know the words within those documents and understand that these are pivotal moments in our history. So I just think looking at the original documents is important, and breaking down the language. And a lot of kids, I think, don't realize how rich these documents are in the English language. Like Lincoln was steeped in Shakespeare. He was steeped in the King James Version of the Bible. So, when he spoke the way he did, a lot of that language comes from earlier eras. And it's good to talk about that, because I think a lot of the way the kids talk today is very basic. And I think I have a hard time going through some of these documents and breaking down the language, but I think that's a helpful exercise in understanding our past. So I agree, David. I think those original documents are key.
Nicole or Jenna?
No, I agree. I would just, put in the caveat, obviously, about like age appropriateness. Like my second grader is probably like not great at reading the Gettysburg Address, but it was something that when I was in graduate school, like we always only read the original documents and then analyzed it from there. But again, I think this is where, the role of the teacher comes in. We can read the foundational documents, but are we holding it to today's standards, or are we discussing it in the context of, when that happened? And I think that's, where we see a lot of today's teachers get tripped up is, well, it sounds like the founding fathers weren't supportive of LGBT rights. Well, it wasn't on their radar, right? And so I think it's, to give support to teachers and remind them kind of what, where we're trying to go to, and to give them that support, and, backed up by what parents want. And, so I think that's my only caveat.
Yeah, Nicole, I'm so glad you brought that up, because one of the things that I try to emphasize in my classes is understanding the history from the perspective of the person that lived during that time. And a lot of teachers, I think, teach from, our perspective looking back on history. And that's why I always go back to this concept of being nuanced and having a complex understanding of history, because we need to understand that for Lincoln's time, he was considered a very progressive thinker on the issue of race. And so I always get a kick out of people that want to bring a statue of Lincoln down or criticize Lincoln without understanding the context. If you look at just from our perspective, it's a totally different view. So the idea of understanding history from the viewpoint of the people that lived it is so vital.
And I will just add, this is not our formal recommendation, I think, but it'd be wonderful to have like one of the required courses for teacher licensure, just be how to learn how to read the older documents, because teachers need this too, this introduction to the language. So a historical documents reading and teaching course to prepare you to in turn be able to teach the Gettysburg Address, the Declaration of Independence. How should I put this? The Second Amendment's grammar is not easy for just like a really famous argument, thing which matters now, just dealing with 18th century grammar. And actually, and I'll mention for that, and that has to do with legal construction and the language of legal construction, particularly the 18th century version. So all of that is needed for not just a lawyer, but any sort of history teacher could, I think, benefit from that. And maybe we should require them to do it too. So it's about 3:30. I left it a little flexible at the end, but I think we've had a wonderful panel discussion. I guess I would like to ask if I could, each of the three of you to have like a last little summary minute or so of something to say, then I would say something, and then I just close up this launch. I'll do it in reverse alphabetical order just for kicks. Jenna, would you be so kind?
I've said everything that I want to. It's a great document. I encourage people to read through it and test yourself, because I thought that was fun and instructive. And it really was a testament to what a great document this is, and how much our schools and our students could really benefit from having rigorous, comprehensive, smart standards for history education. And it's something that's really lacking right now. And so I endorse this document. I think great work, David.
Thank you. Doug.
Yeah, I say the same thing, David. Kudos to you for producing such a wonderful, thorough, and well-balanced document. I am thrilled to use this at some point in the future and promote it. I think it's a very positive step. I think sometimes we criticize the current system, but we don't have an alternative. So this is great. The other thing I'll add is that I think the opposition that we face, whatever you call it, is actually a paper tiger. And I think a lot of the people that are promoting these woke ideas are actually not that bright. I think that they're promoting almost like an anti-intellectual curriculum. And I think that meetings like this are very reassuring to me. Sometimes I feel like I'm alone on a little island promoting or thinking about ways that are different from, what everyone else is saying. So I think that there's a group of people gathering, and I think our voice is being heard. And I'm just excited that we can have conversations like this. And thank you again so much for putting so much time and effort for producing such a wonderful document.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Nicole.
Yeah, I mean, I echo what my co-panelist said before. I told my son yesterday the phrase, "Those who don't know the past are doomed to repeat it." And I think we have seen this sadly bear out in real life on college campuses. It's one of the reasons that I started Parents Defending Education was in my work when I ran Speech First, a campus free speech group. I came to realize that many college students actually didn't understand the First Amendment because they had never received a proper civics education in the first place. And yes, you know what? You're going to hate the First Amendment if the first time you hear it is, "This is why Richard Spencer can come to campus." Instead, if you realize, this is this is how suffragists were able to persuade, the Americans of the importance of the women's right to vote. It's how we were able to defeat Jim Crow. Suddenly it's much more powerful. And so, a citizenry that is educated, that understands where they have come from, is able to better chart a path going forward. So to enable parents to advocate for such an education for their children benefits not only those children, but it benefits our country as a whole. And so I thank you for having the vision to frame this out. And I look forward to our parents on the ground being able to, carry this with pitchforks and torches to state capitals and school board meetings, saying, "This is what we want. This is the kind of education we want, because what you have been doing doesn't work." We have been gaslit for so much, for so long recently. The people who are unhappy with what's happening in schools don't want to teach history. I think this debunks that, right? We definitely want to teach history. We want it to be taught comprehensively and thoughtfully. That has not been taking place, and you have shown us how we can do that.
Thank you so much. Gosh, everybody's been so thankful, and you're reminding me what I really need to do, I must say, is everybody who did this, there's a huge steering committee and executive committee, and there were all sorts of expert consultants. And it's going to be invidious if I mention just one or two of them. But I mean, I guess it wasn't just me. And I guess I want to mention in particular, Joshua Katz, formerly of Princeton, much to Princeton's shame, did an enormous amount of just general comment, not just the substantive parts of the standards, the introduction and how it was written. And I just want to be a mention. He really did quite an extraordinary amount to make it better, pervasively. And then I guess I would say the world geography and world history got an enormous amount to Ian Wendt and Lowell Gustafson, who really went to town to make it that better. And so I apologize to every other expert consultant, but I just did want to mention those in particular. But everybody who's done this, and and everybody at the National Association of Scholars who has been copy editing, proofing, graphic designing, it doesn't take a village. It takes an enormous number of people to make this happen. And it could not have happened, and I'm deeply grateful. I just want to say that, and then to anybody watching, take this, go with it. We can do this. We can bring back good social studies instruction to our country. And it'll be great. It's going to be fun working and going on for this for the next 10 or 20 years. So that's me first speaking as a panelist. As the moderator, I'm just going to say thank you all for tuning in. I will say again, any questions, send them to me, randall@nas.org, RANDALL@nas.org. Be glad to pass it on. This will be recorded within 24 hours on our YouTube channel, and I believe on our American Birthright homepage. Thank you, everyone, so